So, noswaith dda pawb, a chroeso I webinar Merched Cymru. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to Merched Cymru's webinar. Merched Cymru, for those of you who aren't familiar with the Welsh language, means Women of Wales. We are a grassroots group of women from across Wales and are working to protect and strengthen the sex-based rights of women and girls. Our members and followers include women from different age groups, ethnic backgrounds, sexual orientations, disabilities, and we have women of faith and those who have none. We are not aligned with any political party and we welcome a range of political perspectives. As part of the annual international 16 Days of Activism, Merched Cymru presents two webinars. Today's is the second of that series. The 16 Days of Activism makes it clear that male violence against women and girls is perpetrated because they are women and girls, because of their biological sex. We believe it is imperative to be able to recognise and name this when so many women and girls in the UK and around the world are subjected to male violence and abuse on such a massive scale. My name is Deirdre Johnston and I will be your chair for the event this evening. I'm on the executive board of Merched Cymru and I'm also active in other women's rights groups. We have two speakers this evening, followed by a Q&A session. The Q&A box will be open, so please put any questions you have in there and we'll do our best to answer them all. We're delighted to welcome Dr. Jo Payton and Ali Morris, co-founders of A Best Friends Handbook, a resource for teenage girls to help them effectively navigate abuse, relationships and body image. A Best Friends Handbook has recently become a community interest company. Our first speaker is Dr. Jo Payton, who will present a case study on the UK's first conviction for conspiracy to commit female genital mutilation, FGM, drawing on her role as an expert witness in the recent trial of Emad Kaky. Dr. Payton will contextualize this case within broader issues of FGM, forced marriage, harmful traditional practices, offering insights into the challenges of responding to these crimes in the UK. She has a PhD in criminology and wrote her thesis on honor-based violence in the Kurdistan region of Iraq. Dr. Payton's publications include Honor and the Political Economy of Marriage. She has worked on the films Banal's A Love Story and White Right, both Emmy Award winners, Jihad, Muslim in Trump's America, America's War on Abortion, a BAFTA Award winner, and America's domestic violence. And on the quieter side, Jo has two daughters. Over to you, Jo.
I wouldn't necessarily say my daughters are quiet. Thank you very much for that lovely introduction, Deirdre. And thank you very much, Merched Cymru, for inviting me, and particularly for Ali, who is probably the source of that invitation. I'm very pleased to be talking about FGM as part of the 16 Days Against Violence Against Women, recognising that it is a real problem in the UK, but is often not understood and under-recognised, particularly in areas which are not as diverse as, say, London, where I used to work with the Iranian and Kurdish Women's Rights Organisation. Can I get my first slide, maybe? That is lovely. Thank you very much. So this was not the first prosecution for FGM at all. It was the first prosecution of a parent, but that's actually quite important. The two prosecutions prior were from the kind of women who carry this out, the women who accept money to perform FGM. And prosecuting a parent was quite important because there is a sense that if you cut off the demand, the kind of supply of these services will dry up, because these women who perform these operations, they've got a vested interest, they're harder to change. So how did I get invited to be the expert cultural witness in this case? I was recommended by ICRO, the Iranian Kurdish Women's Rights Organisation, and what that involved was using my knowledge and my sort of research background to, first off, write a witness statement. You don't get paid very much for writing witness statements, but I still turned in 26 pages, which is partly a sign of not really hard work, but how hard it was to make the case. I mean, the problem is that I was trying to talk about an area of Iraq where there's very little data, so I had to combine a lot of resources. I was looking over to look at this, and there are sort of over 20 sources that are cited in there. Some of them are just media, but many of them academic papers, NGO reports. I didn't have very much thought that I would end up attending the trial, because it was the first time that I'd written something like this for a criminal case. Normally, I do write a lot of these things, but they're for asylum cases. And it is a reason, it is my opinion of whether a person would be at risk were they to be returned to their country of origin. Another thing I want to say about this case, because FGM is a very grim subject, is that it is a conspiracy case. The perpetrator was put down for conspiracy. Nothing happened to this girl. This was a case, thankfully, all, you know, a very welcome development. It was a case where action was taken in time, and the girl was saved from any harm, or, well, any of the harms that were appertaining to the child marriage she was likely to be forced into, and the FGM which would have preceded that. Can I get my next slide? That's lovely, thank you. So this is kind of the basics of the case, that there is your perpetrator. He was living in Nottingham at the time of the arrest. He moved to Swansea afterwards. He was a PhD student. Actually, I read some of his research. He was a zoologist, very interested in the conservation of the natural animal life of Iraq. What else I learned from looking through this is that he came from, well, his name is Emad Kaky, and there is quite a powerful Kaky tribe in the region of Diyala from which he came. Diyala is a region in Iraq which is one of the least recovered from the war. It's got a very strong presence of ISIS in the region. There's a lot of unrest. There's a huge amount of poverty, and there are over 40,000 internally displaced persons in that region. It borders Iran, and it's quite to the north. And his father, if he was is described as a tribal leader, and in these contexts, if your father is a tribal leader, that is a man who needs to exert control over the family to maintain his status, to maintain his position within the tribe. Next slide, please. So the prosecution that I suppose hired me, but you don't really count how it hired, because you don't get paid really, had quite a difficult case to argue in many respects. They had a lot of things they had to prove because the crime was planned to be committed in Iraq. They had to get an expert in before me to testify that FGM is illegal in Iraq. They had to prove that FGM is practiced in Iraq, which was my responsibility. And they had to prove that he had committed some act within the jurisdiction of England and Wales as part of this conspiracy. Otherwise, they wouldn't have had any jurisdiction. So I was there to be the cultural expert, and the evidence in this case came from an organization called WADI, W-A-D-I. Now, that is a Kurdish women's organization which operates in Iraq and Germany. And they have a very strong record of combating violence against women in Kurdistan, which has then become extended outside the region. And they have made estimates. They don't have the same kind of statistical knowledge outside of the Kurdistan region once they get to the rest of Iraq. But they've got a fairly good estimate that there's about an 8% incidence rate outside Kurdistan, and which would come to just under 4 million women and girls at risk. This is also, I think, Deirdre mentioned earlier that I was in a movie called Bana's A Love Story, and that was a case of an honor killing, and that was the first extradition from Iraq. So it's kind of quite interesting that I've been involved in both of these cases where there's been a historic extradition from Iraq. So the evidence they needed was, some of it was documentary stuff. They proved that Kaky had booked and paid for the girls' travel, but obviously that doesn't mean much in isolation. What they actually had was a witness. I'm not going to give away anything about this witness's identity, but this witness provided WhatsApp messages which showed Kaky planning to conduct this child marriage and this FGM. And this key witness reported and testified in court. Without that person, there would be no case, there would be no prosecution. Can I get my next slide, please? Thank you. Yes. Do you know, whenever anyone does a slideshow, there's always a really busy slide because they put everything on it. That's the one. These are the things that I needed to prove and was questioned on in court. That there are a variety of forms of FGM. I don't want to labor this too much. You might be familiar with it. Sort of according to the World Health Organization, there's 4 forms, going from the most severe, which is an entire excision, to the least, which are the removal or kind of mutilation of the clitoris, or the removal of the labia. And I was saying that the most likely form in Iraq was the former, would be the removal of the clitoris. And what were I was questioned on the implications for future health. And while a lot of the research will talk about more severe forms, there are actually unexpected responses even to the clitoridectomy, because the scarring leads to a lot of flexibility and a quite significantly increased risk of death in childbirth, besides the psychological and sexual damage this would cause. And the other thing is that FGM is generally, if you tell someone about FGM, they will leap to the assumption that this is an African practice, because this is what we largely hear about. But it's actually quite common in various parts of the Middle East. Various kind of quite distinct parts. Like, there are some places where there is none, where it's unthinkable, where if you spoke to anyone about it, they'd find it just as revolting as I would or you would. But there are some areas where it's patchy. The scripture isn't clear. There is some suggestion that there are kind of particular trends within the Muslim world, historic. And because there was a lack of regional data, that's why I sort of looked for Kurdish women's organizations. And I think the lack of regional data just speaks to the lack of the kind of powerful feminist movement that we associate with the Kurdistan region, where there are women out there combating this, where they've achieved some degree of political power and a good deal of cultural power. I was also asked to talk about the relationship between FGM and forced marriage and child marriage, because this was a sort of combined case. The 2 crimes were happening at the same time. The discussions in the WhatsApp were talking about a sort of a preparation. So I was describing then that how girls who are within practicing communities, the girls who had not had this done were sort of, it's as if what they touch becomes contaminated. It's not even just a sort of sexual thing. The whole mythology about it is very steeped in language of contamination and dirt. I want to sort of stress that the informant who helped so much was from a similar culture and a similar background, but from a non-practicing tribe, and was revolted by this as anyone else would be. So FGM kind of will quite often happen within a context where there is child marriage, where there is not chosen marriages. And these come in the Middle East with family structures called endogamy, which means in marriage, where you have kind of assumptions that your daughter will marry a cousin. This will quite often go together as part of the way that the family is structured, the way that society is structured, and the way that the tribe is strengthened. So when we come back now to the knowledge that the perpetrator's father was a kind of village leader, we can see that he would be under pressure to maintain traditions, also to reinforce family bonds. So these two things, they come together. The genital mutilation, the planned marriage of this young girl, we're all part of the same kind of patriarchal structure. Child marriage is not actually legal in Iraq, but a third of marriages are conducted off the books anyway, and they are treated as legitimate within their community, even though they don't have a legal standing. They might be kind of remarried when they reach the legal age for the country, but it doesn't mean that you can't find an imam who will marry off a very young girl. And I am sure you've all seen in the news stories about the kind of Shia faction looking for a reduction of the age of marriage in Iraq to gel with that of Iran. So according to Girls Not Brides, about a quarter of girls in Iraq are married before the age of 18 and 5% before the age of 15. I also had to talk about dowry, which is how it was translated in the text. But through contextual clues and my sort of general knowledge, I realized this was not about dowry as we understand it in kind of the European tradition or even the Asian tradition, but something called bride price. That this is also a practice that is used to knit families together, that the father there is talking about the FGM will occur, the marriage will happen, and he will receive a dowry. So there was money going to the father. That had not been recognized by the translator. So I had to clarify that mistranslation. Some of this comes to explain the pressure that there was on this father. We would assume that a man with a PhD, a man that was living in the UK, a man that from the look of his publications had quite a healthy future as an academic in front of him, came under that sort of pressure. We kind of assume that it's low information people, but often it's those who've got power within the existing structures that have the biggest stakes in maintaining the family as they are. Okay, next slide, please. Sorry, that heavy slide. Right, so what's coming out of this? I've done enough talking about all the stuff that I know and all the stuff that I said. What are the results now for women and girls in the UK? Well, it's absolutely excellent. It's a massive win. We know now that parents can be held accountable, and some of them will know it too. It reinforces the expectation that the law is here for everyone in this country, regardless of culture. It stresses something, you know, I've been talking a lot about this witness, the importance of using cultural knowledge and sensitivity when you talk about this. If the police had gone in with that witness who came forward in an inhospitable or stigmatizing way, they would not have got the cooperation and they would not have got the win. And that's the importance that we stand up for women and girls in their communities, and we stand up for kind of dissident women and girls, the girls who say no, the girls that say, I won't accept this. On the other hand, there was a lot of pressure for them to get a case like this. I know that women's rights organizations have been pushing and pushing and pushing for the police to get a win like this. Maybe now the pressure's off. Maybe the next one won't be pursued with the same kind of commitment that this is. And the other thing is, as I've said, this is a phenomenon that's quite often associated with West African communities. There's a chance that maybe this will have a kind of limited impact. It might circulate amongst Iraqis, amongst people who know about this case, but maybe it won't get beyond that. Maybe there's limitations. We can't lose the momentum of this win. We have to go forward from it. Okay, that's the last slide coming up now, I think. Yes. My key takeaway is that all of these harmful traditional practices, they are parts of the same thing. They are all parts of patriarchal family structures. We can't separate them from each other. If you're going to get one of these, you're probably going to get others, and you need to look for them together. I also kind of want to say a little bit, I mentioned before what a chaotic environment it was in Diyala. This increases tribal traditions. There's a need for solidarity when you are living in the utter chaos of practically a war zone. There are a lot of women forced into prostitution because they're internally displaced. They don't have any other way to live. It's very hard for families to protect each other, and this just leads to the intensification of tribal structures. I mean, a lot of the comments that I was reading from an Oxfam report, which was excellent on the situation of Diyala, show the impacts of the political upon the family structure. We need our tribe to live in Iraq. We need our backs in times of weakness. We're not strong without our tribe, but it doesn't mean you have to sacrifice your daughter. That's what the informant said, clearly knowing that the political situation leads to this kind of violence against women. Until women can take control of their own sexual and reproductive lives without interference from men, then this is going to continue. We need to see these things as connected. There are 2 QR codes up there. I'm not expecting anyone to look at them now, but if anyone's watching this later on YouTube, you can scan those and look at more information, because I've got quite a lot of papers, most of them free. My email's up there if you've got any questions, if you'd like to know more, if you've got any thoughts or comments. And thank you, Deirdre, for sharing. Thank you very much, Mercury Cymru, for inviting me. Yes, thank you.
Thank you, Jo. That was really interesting, fascinating, dreadful, and yet it certainly was a message of hope at the end. And we've now, convicted in this country for that crime, and hopefully it will give others the courage to come forward if they know this is happening within their community. And as you say, it's about supporting them. So now we move on to our second speaker, Ali Morris. Ali is a full-time feminist activist and a role model for me, actually, and campaigner. She's a qualified social worker, having spent nearly 30 years working in the women's sector, 15 years of those as her local authority specialist, violence against women, domestic abuse and sexual violence social worker, long sentence. After years of ill health and disability, she retired in 2019 and now runs her own specialist male violence against women and girls training and consultancy business. She's on the executive committee of Merched Cymru, is Filia's Wales lead, chair of Swansea Bay Resistors and a member of Women's Rights Network. She has a particular passion in fighting prostitution, pornography and sexual violence, and believes these are key elements that keep women entrenched in patriarchy, both the cause and the conduit for male violence. Jo and Ali will both be attending Westminster Abbey this week for Princess Kate's Carol concert as a thank you to them for their work with girls. Ali still manages to find time to read her large collection of feminist books, gets creative with a sewing machine and take her Jack Russell Bertie for a walk. She's got 3 fantastic children, 4 grandchildren who look after Bertie when she's busy feministing. Over to you, Ali.
Thank you, Jean. And yeah, thank you, Jo. It's going to be a hard presentation to follow, but obviously I will try. So I'll share my presentation. So this is going to come up. Anything up with the way present. Excellent. Hopefully everybody can see that and hear me okay. So I will be talking about my 3 trips now to Japan. And just to say that I've been doing the work in Japan on behalf of Filia. So they started in 2022 when Filia really wanted to I suppose, do some global work and try and take our sort of vision across the globe to other women. They were very lucky to get some funding in 2022 and just asked me if I wanted to go. And I was obviously very pleased and honoured to be asked. And I just said yes. And now it's just sort of escalated and rolled into this huge piece of work that I've become involved with. So the purpose of the exchange visit, and originally it was an exchange visit. So we had a woman who lived in Japan and who was a feminist as well. She originally came over to the conference in 2022 when we were in Cardiff. So some of you may remember that. And then I went out to Japan just after the conference in 2022. So the purpose of the exchange really was quite simple. It was around sisterhood and solidarity. And, you know, for those of you that know Philia, that's part of our aims and objectives. And I think, you know, sisterhood and solidarity really is a key tenet of feminism. So it was about a learning opportunity. And again, really, that was about an exchange of information and how we could learn from each other and learn from each other's country. An exchange of ideas. So, you know, looking at Japan and looking at the UK, we do things very, very differently, purely because of our culture, the way, you know, where women are in terms of politics, education, all that kind of thing, and about mutual support, just to give each other confidence in what we were doing across the globe. So that's really where I went before I sort of jumped on the plane to go. But before I went, I thought I'd better know a bit about Japan. So I did put my head into a book and I Googled as much as I could about Japan. And to be honest, I was really shocked before I went. I had a totally different viewpoint of what Japan was going to be. What we see in the West about Japan is actually not what is happening in Japan. Most people think Japan is a Western country, but it's not. We have a vision of it being a Western country purely because of the technology that it has. And I think, you know, that's where it really stops. So I looked at 4 areas before I went originally, and I still look at those every year when I go now. So the first one was around gender equality in the country. And for those of you that are familiar with the annual Gender Equality Index, that's a huge piece of work done on 146 countries every year. So in 2022, Japan, out of 146 countries, was only number 116. So very, very low down, you know, the rankings. The year after, 2023, it actually jumped up to 125. But when I went again this year, it slipped back down to 118. So I was really surprised at that, because they were below China. They were below Iran and Iraq, some of the countries where you would assume, you know, where women's rights obviously are not high on the agenda, but you'd assume that Japan was. So they looked at 4 areas in the Gender Equality Index, which was politics, education, health, and the workforce, the labour workforce of women. Now, Japan is really let down in 2 areas of that, and that is around politics. So currently, there's only about 10% of women in the higher chambers of Japan's parliament, but there's around 60 to 70% of women who are on the local level, so our version of councillors. So you can see the disparity of where the women are. Women aren't the lawmakers. Women don't make those decisions that will affect their lives. They're very much doing the groundwork in their own communities. And also around labour workforce. There's so much, I mean, you could do a whole hour on just Japan's labour workforce with women. So most women do work, but they're actually in law not entitled to equal pay with men, even if they're doing the same job, which I found quite astonishing. So that was, you know, I suppose covering, overarching what I was thinking about. So then I looked at girls, because it was the girls that I was going to work with specifically, girls who are exploited by prostitution and pornography. So girls at that time, only up until last year, the legal age of consent was 13. And I think that had a massive impact on how girls are treated in the country in terms of the sexualization of them. That had been in place since 1907. And as I said, last year, it was actually changed in Parliament and the legal age of consent is now 16. Although when I went back this year, that hasn't really come into force yet. So it's made no difference whatsoever to girls. Anime is a big one. That's I suppose, making a difference to how we sexualize the girls out there. So for those that know what anime is, you know, the drawings and the cartoons are very, very sexualized versions of young girls. You know, the massive breasts, tiny little waists, and they're usually in school uniforms or some kind of child. You know, you basically, you know, they're children and young girls. And they have cafes in Japan, very much like the old geisha cafes, but they're now teenage girls dressed up in anime costumes where they serve middle-aged men and above cups of teas, but basically those men then can, you know, put their hands on their bum and put their hands on their breasts, and basically that can sort of, you know, filter down into prostitution and meeting those girls outside of those cafes. So all that is legal in Japan, but again, it's just out there in the open. So in terms of pornography and prostitution, which is one of my sort of key areas that I'm really interested in, for the last few years, I'd say, well, at least 3 or 4 since I've been working on this, Japan has been the number one, number one viewed categories across the global pornography websites. So that could be Japan, hentai, anime, Japanese girls, but anything with Japan in it, it's been number one for the last 3 years while I've looked. So that gives you an indication of how Japanese women and girls are viewed globally in terms of availability and sexualization. So because of that, there's a massive homegrown pornography industry in Japan. We don't really get that in the UK. We get that in Europe, sort of Romania, Ukraine, that sort of area, but we don't really get that in the UK. So I think when you see that around you, it's really overwhelming to see. You can see it everywhere you go. What I want to say about the pornography and prostitution industry, because of this global idea of Japanese women and girls, is there's that huge element of racism within that, how they see Japanese women and girls, the availability of them and the subservience of them. But also there's a lot of what I'd say was child abuse within that, because Japanese women and girls tend to look younger than Western women purely because they're tiny. So if you see Japanese pornography, they're always made up to look like they're much younger than they are. So basically they're made up to look like they're children. They're in school uniform. They're there with a teddy bear. They've got ponytails in their hair. So we know pornography and prostitution is very much geared towards the idea that they are children. They are children being sold to these, you know, these men that are looking at them. So really, I was faced with that, but I didn't understand until I got there that the overarching culture in Japan, not just women and girls, but men and boys, of obedience and respect, and this culture of, you know, honor, is so entrenched. It is such a barrier to women and girls, which I will talk a bit about. Yeah, you know, as somebody from the West, it really, really surprised me. So that was what I knew I was going into. So I had visits, as I said, in 2022, 2023, and this year. Lots and lots of stuff. So I was only there for a week, so I really crammed everything in. So I did a lot of organizational visits. The first year I visited, I think it was five organization and grassroots groups. I did lots of presentation on loads of different things. My work, myself, Philia, lots of workshops. What they really enjoyed was the Q&A sessions where they could just throw things at me. I mean, last year I had one for 4 hours and that was really overwhelming. The first year I also did a uni conference. So they set up this whole conference just for me and Nat, the woman who came over. And we did a conference, what we had found. Speaker's Corner. Now they've got a very weird law in Japan, which has come over apparently from like the 1940s, and it still hasn't been taken out of legislation, where you're allowed to go anywhere in Tokyo as long as you don't like go on double yellow lines or you're not on a crossing, and you can literally stand there with all your banners and a little van and loudspeakers, and you can say what you want to say. And there were people with animal rights, there was stuff around the war, there's loads of things. So we went out every year. I've done that, and I was just there with my, with my loudspeaker. I did some campaigns with them, but the highlight of my work is always when I meet the survivors. So I meet the teenage girls and the young adult women who have been in prostitution and pornography. I meet with the activists, support workers, academics, and I've met journalists as well. So the first year, some of you may have seen some of the work I did around this, was when I went on the outreach bus with Collabo to the red light district. So every year I've been very, very upset over something. So the first year I went, this was the thing that had me in tears when I went back to the hotel room that night. So the red light district, first of all, I want to say, is not like a red light district you'd think of like Soho, dirty, half-naked women, pictures everywhere, people drunk, shouting. It was nothing like that. I didn't even realize I was in the red light district. Tokyo is so clean. I mean, it's the cleanest place I've ever been to. So you walk into this district and you just think it's like an entertainment area. Everything's quite quiet. No nudity, no pictures of naked women, no naked women on the street or hanging out at the doors. It was really confusing for me coming from, seeing, so I suppose I said Soho and other different red light districts. So I went out in Collabo's van, and they basically set up what they call a cafe once a week for their teenage girls that they support. And it's like a military operation. You go in the van. So the van you can see there is packed to the roof with food, clothing, tables and chairs, soft toys for the girls. I mean, it's just heartbreaking. And they set it up with a massive pink gazebo. I mean, everything is gorgeous. Lights, you say tables and chairs, they can charge their phones, boxes and boxes of food. What's interesting with that, though, what was different for the UK, is when they enter, they have to sign a contract. So most of the girls have been there week after week, but they have to sign a contract to say they will sit down and have emotional support as well. So they can't just go in and take food and clothing like a lot of the UK projects do. You have to sit down and get some, emotional support and practical support around housing and that kind of thing. Yeah, so that was a really interesting thing for me to watch. One of the things I remember being in the cafe was a group of British men, because I recognize the accent, just coming outside and standing there and trying to intimidate what we were doing with the girls. That was quite common apparently, but to see the British men doing that, they were obviously there for some kind of stag do, waiting for these teenage girls to come out. So when I say teenage, I mean 12, 13-year-olds. So that was, one of the sort of the main things I did that year. And as part of my night with them, they took me around the red light district, and they have these resource packs that they hand out when they see the girls on the street. So there's some of the pictures of the red light district. And as you can see, what's really interesting for the first look is they're all boys. There's no girls on the pictures. So the whole structure of the red light district is totally different to what we find. It's all around host clubs. And again, you can read up on host clubs, which is very, very interesting. But basically, host clubs, put succinctly and very, very short, they're staffed by young men. So you can see the pictures up there who look very old-fashioned to us. They're almost like the old sort of goth styles from like the 90s, early 2000s. But they're very much in the dress of what is K-pop. Very sort of smart and totally different to what, the usual Japanese boy and man would look like. They basically go out on the street, and you can see the middle picture, and they're doing it now. There's two young guys there. So they're basically pimps, and they go out and entice young girls into these host clubs where they are the ones that the young girls buy drinks for. It's shifted around. So what happens is the drinks, as you can imagine, are ridiculously priced. And I mean £200 for a bottle of lager. Girls don't know that. So once they buy a drink for these boys, they're then in debt. So then they have to keep coming back because they're in debt to the club, they're in debt to the boys. but they've got a very strange system where the boys have to sell so many drinks a week, and the more drinks they sell, the more money they get themselves, because they've enticed these girls in. So it's on this very, very strange system, but it's all about money, all about profit. But what host clubs are, and if you physically go around the red light district, there are clubs. So you've got clubs, and next door to the clubs are hotels. So you have a club and a hotel which is linked together. They're owned by the same organization of people, but basically they're a cover for criminal gangs. So the host clubs will become somewhere where young girls will become indebted to these men, and the only way out of the debt that they've created by buying the drinks for these boys is they get taken next door into the hotel, where obviously they're prostituted. And that becomes what happens. It's a very, very quick process. So again, they target the girls. A lot of the boys, because they are very, very young, these boys that are basically pimps, they go into the bus station or they go to the local train station and they look for young girls who are coming in, who are runaways, who are homeless, pick them up off the street, take them up into this area, and the whole process begins. They start love bombing them, and these girls genuinely believe that these boys are their boyfriends. Clearly they're not. They've got about 10 girls on the go at once, but what they're doing is enticing them into the clubs to get them to start buying the drinks which they can't afford. I mean, these girls are homeless and 12, 13, 14 years of age, get into debt bondage, and the only way they can get out of it is into prostitution, which eventually becomes into pornography as well. So when you go around the place, I say the worst thing for me was I saw lines and lines of girls on the pavement, as I said, 13, 14, 15 years old, in a sort of anime style, so you knew who they were instantly, holding up placards with the name of the host club where they could be bought. And then you'd see 50-year-old men passing them, stopping and looking at the name of the club, and obviously going off to say, I want that girl over there. And then they would take them to the hotel that was attached to the host club. And this was as open as you could imagine. You know, children on the street just lined up like I've never seen it. I was just absolutely heartbroken. So that is the way, not all of it, but most of the red light district operates. There are some other areas, and you may have seen in the news, on-street prostitution is becoming more prevalent now. And that's, you know, Japan is not happy about that, which I find actually quite hilarious, because it's happening, you know, it's happening in plain sight in the red light districts and other places. A lot of that is around Japan is going through a dreadful economic downturn at the moment. So you've got plenty of tourists coming over, specifically sex tourists again, and all the parks, you know, and they're literally rounding up the women, prosecuting the women for being in the parks, but the men are still coming from not just Japan, but from obviously abroad as well. So the situation really is dire for children, because these girls are children. So what were we going to do? What did Philly want to do when they went over? So really there was 3 steps we were thinking about. The first one is we had to look at what's happening in Japan through a feminist lens, which Japan is just not doing at all. And we were looking at broader rights of women and girls, which is, you know, how they ended up in prostitution and pornography. And again, sisterhood, solidarity, support, which is Philly's 3 main tenets. Step 2 was about taking my experience and my knowledge around the sex industry out there, and then, you know, through talks, Q&A sessions, offloading that into the workers and to the young girls to see if that could make a difference. And then training. So I always did a training session on something every year that I went. So the first year I went, I did it on Philia's Women First Toolkit. Then the year after, I did it on me and Jo's Best Friends Handbook. And then this year, I did it on consciousness raising. And we actually translated Philia's consciousness raising handbook into Japanese, and we handed those out when I got there. So here's some evidence that I did actually do some work. So I did try and do some sightseeing as well. So the ones where I'm holding up the, the purple brochure was the first year, and the one in the middle where I'm on the microphone, that was me doing the speaker's corner. Then the one when I'm in the tartan dress is the second year I went. And then the two on the right was this year. And the bottom two women were the original founders of Tokyo Rape Crisis. So it was a massive honor to be having, lunch with those. So the sex industry then really is in plain sight, as I've said. The sexualization and just prostituted girls are everywhere. You can just see it. Once you know what you're looking for, you can see it everywhere. So it is in real life. So it is in the red light district, and I said other areas I've said. But they also perform in public, and I'll show you a picture now. So the second year I went, this was the thing that upset me. You don't see buskers really that often. They're allowed on a Saturday night. So in central Tokyo on a Saturday night, I just saw men, no women, gangs of men with all their phones up, surrounding something, and I could hear music going. And I was like, said to my interpreter, what on earth's that? And she was pulling me away, just walk, just walk. And basically what the like the K-pop stable, as they say, they do a female version of it. So for young girls who want to become these K-pop singers, they go to what can I say? They like to call them like the gymnastics in Russia, when they go away when they're 7 and they come back when they're 13 and they Olympic stars. They do it to young girls there if they want to become singers. But what they do, they know they're not going to become singers because they're just not good enough. These are young girls trained to become the next pornography performers. So you've got 14-year-old girls singing and dancing in the middle of Tokyo, who I was watching them, clearly couldn't sing or dance, but the men were there videoing them because they knew that next year or the year after, they were going to be there on the next pornography videos coming out. And magazines, posters and clothing is just everywhere. It's just so different to us. So you can see some of the things I was talking about. The two bigger pictures with the men, they were the ones just crowding those, and I've circled them, those two girls, again, dressed in very sort of anime style, just waiting for them to come out in the next films. T-shirt I saw hanging just in a normal T-shirt shop. And the one on the bottom with the bikes, that was on a street next to the zoo that I went to visit one day, children passing, and it was just for a porn film theatre, just there on the street. It was just unbelievable. And then there's magazines of these young girls who want to become the stars, but we know what they're going to be into next. So not many left. I'll be there now. So the conclusion then. So as a white Western woman, I really panicked when I went over there first, thinking, I don't want to be this woman going into Japan, telling them what to do when I had no idea what it was like out there. But the first thing I've learned every time I go, women and girls in Japan are desperate for global support. They feel so isolated, and without any other feminist interventions, they just know they're not going to get anywhere. Japan has almost no law on equality that will support women. So when they ask me things like, well, how on earth do you do that in the UK? How on earth did that, that happen? How are you winning all these laws around, workplace rights and things? We have the Equality Act. Japan doesn't have a version of that. So they have nothing to fall back on. And it's very difficult then to give them any real concrete advice when they can't actually put that into practice. So I think the next step is going to try and get some equality laws in place. I'd say Japan is about 70 years behind us. So I'd say about the 1950s in terms of the way women are treated, the expectations of women throughout their life. I mean, their lives are just tracked out for them already. But for me, a big one was Japan's culture of respect, and the expectations related to sex, to women, are huge barriers for women because they just will not break that culture of respect. Because if they do, it's very similar to what Jo was talking about with the Muslim populations. If they dare come out of their roles, their sex-based roles, they're ostracized by their whole communities, not just by their families. One woman who I've seen for 2 years in a row, she had to leave her husband everything, because she wanted to join the women's liberation movement, and they just couldn't tolerate her doing that. So she lost her husband, and because of that. So if you can, do anything to help the women and girls in Japan, whether that's just emailing an organization, looking for more information around it, please do. Thank you for listening to that. I normally take about an hour. So that was just a very, very brief overview of what I've been doing, but I will be going back next year. Yeah, so hopefully I'll have more information then. So thank you.
Oh, thank you, Ali. That was, I can't say it was wonderful, but very, very sobering indeed. You're doing amazing work out there, and proud to know you, girl. So good questions coming in. Actually, one for both of you. Are there any green shoots of growing awareness amongst politicians or other influencers who are taking these issues on, both in Kurdistan or in the Kurdistan area of Iraq and in Japan as well? Is it all grassroots? Is there anybody in any senior role doing anything for them? Jo, do you want to go with that?
You're on mute, Jo.
I feel like I would be very foolish to start making predictions about politics in the Middle East, particularly with what's going on at the moment. In the UK, we have, particularly in London, very robust violence against women organisations, which have been founded by women from the Middle East, from Turkey, and they do excellent work. But like most women's organisations, they're desperately underfunded and under-resourced. And they take on a lot more work, because when you're dealing with a case of a woman who might be at risk of something like honor-based violence, it's very complicated to deal with. Plus, you might have language difficulties. Plus, you might have immigration difficulties, and you need kind of specialist staff. So the women out of that are incredible. So there are organisations doing fantastic work with very little resources. In Kurdistan, there's a absolutely brilliant women's movement, and there is kind of support. The politics there can be a little bit tribal, but they do have women's wings. The women's wings of each party can be a little bit kind of subordinate to the men's wishes, but they do exist, and they do have some kind of influence. If anyone's actually interested, I would recommend Manu Alinia's book, which is very good on the efforts and the kind of boundaries they come up against. But what you can never do is count women out anywhere.
Thanks, Jo. Ali, any green shoots in Japan?
No, I'd say it was the opposite. Obviously, I've been 3 years in a row, and I've almost seen it progress, or the opposite of progress, as I've gone every year. If anything, I think it's the opposite in terms of politicians. There's been some, oh my God, dreadful and atrocious things coming out of really high politicians, their viewpoints on women. So they've actually just come out and said these women need to, get back to the house with the children, or whatever it is. But two of the organizations I've worked with, so Collabo, the one who had the bus this year, I didn't work with them because there's been massive court cases going on because of the strength of opinion against them by not just politicians, but it was a very famous Japanese YouTuber, and that ended up in court. And now they're so scared to work with feminist organizations, or even just to be seen with me. So if anything, their work has now sort of imploded on themselves because they're just so scared. And Rape Crisis, who you saw with the two women I was with, they're still working with Rape Crisis. They had all their government funding withdrawn this year, purely because they said it should have been a women-only organisation in terms of sex-based, single-sex spaces. So they had everything withdrawn because they would not back down. So what's happening is, unfortunately, sort of gender ideology has trampled over women's rights in Japan. I mean, they didn't have any to start with. They've now even got even less. So they're putting in place rights for transgender people, but doing nothing for women's sex-based rights and using that as a weapon to, as you said, take away their funding. So it was in a dire situation when I got there this year. Really not good.
Oh, that's so sad. It really is. Another question, I might close with this one. It's for Jo. You mentioned the case, the Kaky case, and it's the first successful prosecution of a parent for FGM. Do you think the threat of prosecution might make parents feel more able to resist pressures of traditional practices?
Yes, yeah, I absolutely do. And I think that's why there was so much pressure from the kind of women's sector to get a case like this. And there were same arguments as well when we were looking for harsher penalties for forced marriage, because you see a lot of these cases, it's the same kind of feeling I got in the Kaky case. It wasn't really his choice or his decision. It was something that he felt unable to resist. The pressure was coming from his family, from his powerful father. But if he could have said, look, I'm going to end up in prison if you do that, it would have been a bargaining chip. It would be something to put like, no, I can't do this. And there is a very good reason why not. So I think definitely, yes, it can have that effect. But I don't think it will have this effect if Emad Kaky ends up being the first and the last where serious action is taken. So we need there to be consistent. It doesn't always necessarily have to be very high key, but we need consistent action. We need consistent responsiveness to the community, and we need sort of consistent outreach to those people in the community who are ready to say, no, I'm going to stop this.
And there's also a question, would you put the link up? I don't know if we can tonight, but the book you mentioned, Melu.
Yeah, I'm assuming we'll do a newsletter after this. I will put a connection to that because I've forgotten the title, which is not helpful. It's probably called something like Women in Kurdistan, which is why I can't remember. It's something generic.
That's a lovely segue to say, please sign up for our newsletter. You'll get all the news and information of what we're doing, what we're promoting. You can also join us, join Merched Cymru. The link will be on the newsletter. Yeah, we have a couple of minutes to go. Is there anything else anybody wants to add or any further questions? I don't think so. There's one comment here from Amber. Host clubs aren't very different to gentlemen ones here. Women get commission when they sell men bottles of champagne and then are groomed into prostitution. It's a similar model.
Same sort of structure and model of,
So that was fascinating, both of you. We've been very honoured and very pleased to have you both speak with us tonight. And Merched Cymru, thank you very much indeed. Thank you everyone for attending, giving up your Monday evening. As I say, it'll be on our both of the webinars will be on our YouTube channel fairly soon. And we'll also have links to Merched Cymru itself. We have got a website, www.merchedcymru.wales. Facebook, we're just Merched Cymru, and X, formerly Twitter, we're at Merched Cymru. That's it, I think. Yes, thank you so much for being here this evening. And diolch yn fawr iawn am dod. And for the Irish speakers among you, I hywagwf agus croeso. Good night.